Welcome, and thank you for joining us today for the program, The Early Days of the CIA and the Dawn of the Cold War. I'm Cara Malenfant, and I'll be your moderator today. We're so pleased to have all of you join us at the Ethical Humanist Society of Chicago. Our mission is to create a supportive and inclusive humanist community that inspires all to be their best selves. So what do humanists believe? Here's a quote that seemed particularly appropriate for today's topic. Humanism teaches us that it is immoral to wait for God to act for us. We must act to stop the wars and the crimes and the brutality of this and future ages. We have powers of a remarkable kind. We have a high degree of freedom in choosing what we will do. Humanism tells us that whatever our philosophy of the universe may be, ultimately, the responsibility for the kind of world in which we live, rests with us. That comes from Kenneth Pfeiffer, The Faith of a Humanist. Our programs at EHS address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts, and sciences, to name just a few. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing program relating to history. Journalist and author Scott Anderson will talk to us about his new book, The Quiet Americans: 4 CIA Spies at the Dawn of the Cold War, a tragedy in 3 acts. In it, he chronicles the exploits of the CIA's 4 original spies. It's a dark tale exposing the contradictions that made up Americans' foreign policy from post-World War II through the mid-1950s. During this time, America's obsession with fighting communism resulted in undermining democratically elected governments around the world, with a resulting loss of America's moral standing internationally. Scott Anderson is a veteran war correspondent who has reported from Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, Northern Ireland, Chechnya, Sudan, Bosnia, El Salvador, and many other strife-torn countries. A frequent contributor to the New York Times Magazine, his work has also appeared in Vanity Fair, Esquire, Harper's, and Outside. He is the author of novels Moonlight Hotel and Triage, and of nonfiction books The Man Who Tried to Save the World and The 4 O'Clock Murders, and co-author of War Zones and Inside the League with his brother, John Lee Anderson. Scott will present for about 40 minutes, leaving us a generous amount of time to take questions, which you can type into the chat box. Thanks so much, Scott. Over to you.
Thank you, Cara. It's very nice to join you, and thanks for inviting me. I was gonna talk a little bit about how I came to this the topic, and then describe a little bit about the four men I followed through the course of this book, and then to talk about some of what I feel are the broader issues that their stories bring up. Like everyone of my age, I'm kind of a product of the Cold War. I may have felt it more acutely than most people due to the places I grew up. I grew up in East Asia, in Taiwan, Korea, and Indonesia in the 1960s. My father was an agricultural advisor for the American government in those countries. But along with doing agriculture, I think every American overseas officer at the time did sort of double duty, and in addition to his upfront job, he was also a foot soldier in the international war against communism. So what my father was doing in these countries on the kind of soft power, hearts and minds sorts of things, he was involved in doing agrarian reform, distributing emergency relief aid after disasters. But on the kind of darker, hard power side of things, he was also involved in organizing rural vigilante groups to sort of watch herd over the local population for any signs of quote communist taint. And certainly, anyone who would run afoul of the vigilante squads in places like Taiwan or South Korea in the 1960s was not going to have a good time of things. My father's work. My father was a ranch kid from Fresno, California, and a hardcore yellow dog Democrat. And as time went on, he became increasingly troubled by the kind of work he was doing. In 1969, we finally left Asia. We were back in Washington. This was, of course, when the Vietnam War was really ratcheting up, and he used to drag me and my siblings to anti-war demonstrations in Washington. And vowed that if the Vietnam War was still going on when my brother and I came of age, that he was going to take us to Canada. But one kind of funny thing about him is in the run-up to the '72 election, he despised Richard Nixon, and he vowed that if Nixon got reelected in '72, that we were gonna leave the country. He was gonna quit his job and leave the country because he didn't want his kids to grow up in a country where Nixon could be reelected. So of course Nixon did get reelected, and he quit his job, and we emigrated to England. God knows what he would have done if he was still alive. What he would have done when Trump got elected. But so my father's arc was, I mean, he really experienced in a firsthand way the kind of the sins that went along with the anti-communist struggle. And for me, my evolution, it took a bit longer, but it was really crystallized by an event I had in 1984 in El Salvador. El Salvador by 1984, for those who remember this, the dirty war, the death squad war had been going on. It started in 1979, really got going in 1980. And by 1984, the death squad activity, which was synonymous with the right-wing government that in El Salvador, the numbers really had started dropping down, probably just because they'd run out of likely candidates to kill. But there was this fiction still going on within the Reagan administration as an explanation of why they could still support the Salvadoran regime, was that somehow the death squads were completely separate. The right-wing death squads were completely separate from the government. I was in San Salvador, the capital, one day, and I was walking in the middle of the day, just walking down this boulevard. And a van passed me on the street and pulled to the curb, maybe 100, 150 feet in front of me. The sliding door opened, and the body of a woman was thrown out onto the sidewalk. Classic death squad victim. Her hands were tied in front of her. She was probably in her late 20s, early 30s. And I was the only one around on the sidewalk. And as I was, of course, in something of a state of shock, I started walking towards her. And before I got about halfway to her, a military van pulled up alongside her body. So a matter of maybe 10 seconds after the first van had left. Military van pulls up, another sliding door opens, soldiers get out, throw the body in the van, and then drive off. So this whole fiction of that somehow the death squads and the army were separate. I mean, this was clearly a choreographed kind of handoff, body transfer that, from long practice. And I remember that day and that night, this thought that just kept coming back, the question that just kept coming back to me was, how has it come to this? How, in the name of fighting communism, or what some people call communism, how is it that the American government has now come to get into bed with regimes that just murder their citizens in broad daylight and throw them out on the streets? That question stayed with me through the years. As Kara mentioned, I was a war correspondent for a number of years. And in many wars that I covered, I saw how much the roots and the tensions and the schisms that led to the war were often rooted in the Cold War. So about a few years ago, I thought I really want to examine how this happened, what happened to the America of the high ideals of mid-century and to where we got towards the end of the century. And I realized that so much of that change really happened in this very specific 12-year period, essentially from the end of World War II, from about 1944 to the Hungarian Revolution, 1956. So I decided I was going to focus in on that period. In 1944, FDR was talking about how World War II was going to be the end of the age of empire. He was adamant that this was going to be the end of the European empires that were causing so many problems throughout the Third World, the British and the French empires specifically, and also that America was going to be this herald of democracy around the world, that we were going to foster and help install democracies throughout the Third World. You get to 12 years later, and now America is not only supporting the European empires and in Africa and in Asia, but we're actually bankrolling them with the French in Vietnam and with the British in a number of places. And we're now, instead of fostering democracy, we're actually overthrowing democratic regimes in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954. So I really wanted to look at what happened in that period. How did that incredible arc over a 12-year period happen? And as I got to thinking of how I would tell the story, the kind of history I like to do is of people, of so-called ordinary people, but who find themselves thrust into great events, and who kind of through accident or the force of their own will or personality have a huge effect on events. And so as I got thinking about the Cold War, I was thinking, well, who were the people on the front lines of the Cold War? And it was spies. It was intelligence officers of both sides, which was kind of, from my vantage point, kind of a happy thing, because everyone likes to hear about spies. So I set out to find people who operated in different parts of the world, the CIA officers, and who I could tell the story through their own observations and experiences. And I ended up settling on these four people, four men. And I would love to have found a woman, but in the 1950s CIA, the field officers were all men. So I'm just going to talk. Don't really have time to talk about all four of them in any detail. I was just going to briefly mention two of them and then go into a bit more detail on the other two. One of the four was a man named Michael Burke. And Michael Burke is a guy who, it's like he stepped right out of a movie. He extraordinarily handsome, incredibly charming. People who knew him described him as the most charming man they'd ever met. He was a commando for the Office of Strategic Services during World War II. The OSS is kind of the wartime precursor to the CIA. At the end of the war, he goes out to Hollywood. He's a screenwriter for a while. That kind of ends. All throughout Michael Burke's life, he had these just incredible highs and lows. He decides he's going to move to New York in 1948 to become a writer. And I can speak from personal testimony to that. It's a very hard life to make. So he immediately fell into deep poverty. By 1949, he was so broke. He had a wife and young child. At one point, his daughter's pram, her stroller was stolen, and he didn't have the money to get her a new stroller. So they had to carry the daughter everywhere. He gets a call. This is about a year after the CIA was created, and after the kind of covert operations branch of the CIA was created. He gets a call. He meets these two men who won't tell him why they want to talk to him, but they meet in a restaurant in New York. They won't even identify. The Office of Policy Coordination was the covert operations branch of the CIA, and so top secret that its name alone. And obviously the name was chosen for just how boring it is. But the name alone was classified for the next 25 years. So they didn't even tell Michael Burke what they're there for. And over lunch and many drinks, apparently, they say, what do you know about Albania? And Michael Burke doesn't know anything about Albania. He knows that it's a communist regime in Eastern Europe. And they say, we want you to go and start a revolution there. And to do that, they're going to the kind of center of the Albanian emigre population is in Italy. So we're going to pay you $10,000 a year, which is a fortune back then. You have to move to Italy, and you also have a living allowance of $8,000 a year. And at this time in Italy, you couldn't spend $8,000 a year. So of course he immediately says yes. He moves to Italy with his wife and child. And the one funny thing is that as he's going to be meeting with these Albanian conspirators constantly and planning these infiltration operations in Albania. And so he thinks, well, what kind of cover story can I have where I'm throwing money all around. I don't really, I'm not producing anything. I don't really have a job. I'm just kind of hanging out. and it came to him, film producer. So he masquerades as a film producer, and so there's this wonderful story where at the same time he's rushing off to meet clandestinely with these Albanian conspirators. He's hanging out with all these Italian directors and actors in Rome. This is kind of the golden age of Italian cinema. And at one point, he gets worried that people are going to start asking questions. I mean, he's there for over a year organizing this thing, and he thinks, I say I'm a film producer, and I'm not actually producing anything. So, at a certain point, people are going to become suspicious. But what he discovered was that the Italian film people were just as self-absorbed as the people in Hollywood, and all they wanted to do was talk about themselves. They didn't care what he was doing. He could still be there today, as curious as people were about his background. Burke ended up. After being in Rome for a while, he ends up going to Germany and heading up the covert operations of all the CIA covert operations of infiltrating spies and commandos behind the Iron Curtain. The second person that I focused on was a man named Ed Lansdale. Lansdale was an ad executive from San Francisco. He is sent out to the Philippines right after World War II. At a time when the Philippines is ruled by this very corrupt oligarchy. There's a communist insurgency that's getting worse all the time. And Lansdale just comes up with this idea that, it's a pretty basic idea that if you want to win over the local population, you have to give them something to believe in. You have to give them a government that they care about. And he proceeds to find at the time, a very obscure Filipino local congressman, a man named Raymond Magsaysay, and first has Magsaysay become the defense minister, and kind of between the two of them, they completely reformed the Filipino military. They launched this kind of hearts and minds campaign where the soldiers were out restoring wells and schools and local clinics, even helping bring in the harvest. And then he engineers that for Magsaysay to become the next president of the Philippines, defeating the communist insurgency in the Philippines in really dramatic and very short fashion. He then has this reputation within the CIA as the miracle worker of Asia. And then when he comes back to Washington after the Philippines, the CIA director meets with him and goes, "Well, we have a problem going on in another place in Asia, this being Vietnam." In 1954. We just go to Vietnam and do the same thing you did in the Philippines. So Lansdale goes off and he arrives in Vietnam in 1954 as the head of the first American military mission to Vietnam, consisting of himself and 12 other men. Eventually be followed by almost 3 million more American soldiers. He comes very close to actually achieving the same thing in Vietnam in the early days that he achieved in the Philippines. But then for reasons that are a little too complicated to get in here, it all goes haywire, as we all know. So I was going to talk a little bit more about the third character in the book, Frank Wisner. Frank Wisner was from a wealthy Mississippi family. He was educated at UVA, and he was a corporate lawyer on Wall Street. In the run-up to World War II. He just abruptly quits his law firm and joins the Navy, and this is before the Americans had even come into World War II. He ends up also working for the OSS, the Office of the Strategic Services, and he ends up being in Romania in the summer of 1944 in Eastern Europe. Romania had switched sides in the war. They'd been with the Germans. Overnight they flipped. They joined the Allies. You're in an area of Europe where the Soviets were on the border. Wisner is kind of the first American to see what happens when the Soviet Red Army marches into a country. And again, this is a year before the World War II ends. And within weeks of the Soviets arriving in Romania, they had overthrown the government. They'd installed a kind of a communist puppet regime. And what was most haunting to Wisner is he watched as the Soviets ordered the ethnic Germans in the country. There were about 250,000 ethnic Germans. Ethnic Germans were all throughout Eastern Europe at the time, dating back to the 12th century. I mean, they'd been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. Stalin ordered all the ethnic Germans to be rounded up and deported, and basically used as slave labor in the Soviet Union. So Wisner watched these boxcars full of the ethnic German families being sent off to the Soviet Union to work in slave labor, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. He ends up, after the war, he briefly goes back to Wall Street when the CIA decides they're going to launch this covert operations wing. They come to him. He immediately quits the law firm and becomes the head of the OPC. Over the next decade, Wisner ran what was called the Mighty Wurlitzer. And the OPC had operations throughout the world, and ranging from very soft power initiatives to very hard power. Soft power being they started the Paris Review in France. They ran overseas library programs throughout Western Europe. They brought Porgy and Bess from Broadway and had a traveling show going throughout Western Germany. There's this idea that you win through hearts and minds. You show, again, the superiority of the freedom of expression, freedom of creativity in the West. The hard power, everything from trying to overthrow governments to assassinations to buying elections. And Wisner was the man whose fingers were in all of this and running everything. At the same time, while he was doing this, he had one great enemy in Washington, and that was J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover, at the end of World War II, had been desperate that the FBI was going to become the international intelligence agency, and that Hoover would sit on top of all of this, not just the domestic spying, and never forgave Truman for instead creating the CIA. And throughout, Hoover was always targeting the CIA, seeking to destroy it or to at least hobble it however he could. And he had a particular animus for Frank Wisner. Frank Wisner had a wartime dalliance with a princess in Romania. And Hoover used that to periodically put Wisner under investigation throughout his professional life. In 1952, when the Eisenhower administration was just coming in, and it looked like Wisner was going to be chosen as the next CIA director. And 2 weeks after the election in which Eisenhower won, Hoover launches another, this is like the fourth or fifth investigation into Wisner, at the crux of it, this wartime relationship with this Romanian woman. And it's basically what Hoover was doing is sending a message to the incoming administration that, if you put Wisner in as director, I'm going to fight you, and I'm going to destroy him, and it's going to be an embarrassment. So Wisner wasn't named the director, but this, and of course, what Hoover was doing all along too was, sorry, there's a siren. I hope it's not too loud. From 1950 on, he found a very kind of a useful fool in Senator Joe McCarthy. Sorry about that. I live near a hospital. So when Joe McCarthy started with there's 207 Reds in the State Department, Hoover saw that he could use McCarthy as his front man. So he started funneling documents secretly, confidential files to McCarthy, and McCarthy would then go after the people that Hoover wanted to be targeted. And again, including Wisner, including a lot of people right around Wisner, a lot of people in the CIA. So one by one, some of Wisner's closest allies in the CIA were taken out by the Red Scare. Wisner's story ends up really quite tragic. His dream throughout running the OPC was to foment a anti-communist uprising somewhere within the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe, and throughout was authorizing these infiltration operations that Michael Burke was operating, of dropping his commandos behind the Iron Curtain, hoping that he could set up anti-communist guerrilla cells or at least spread propaganda. These operations were universally, virtually universally disastrous. These guys were being picked up within minutes of being hitting the ground. The KGB had all these different anti-communist groups, these emigre groups, thoroughly compromised. And Wisner actually, when the Eisenhower administration came in and really was ramping up the Cold War against the Soviets, he becomes this kind of voice of moderation. He at a certain point after Stalin dies in '53, he's urging the administration to offer an olive branch to the new leaders in the Kremlin. That's ignored. But all of a sudden, this guy who's had a reputation of being a real hardliner becomes much more of a moderate. The ultimate tragedy with Frank Wisner, with this dream of starting a anti-communist rebellion, he finally gets one in Hungary in 1956. There's this spontaneous uprising of the Hungarian people against the communist regime and the Red Army that's in the country, and at a crucial moment, Khrushchev, who's the Soviet premier, who's really just consolidated his power, the revolution gets so out of control and it really takes over the country that he decides he has to let Hungary go. That there's, short of just massive bloodshed, there's no way to, quote, save Hungary. At the same time, Wisner is in Austria, next door to Hungary, and he's urging the Eisenhower administration to kind of live up to there's been this ongoing propaganda war where going back to the late 40s, of urging the Eastern Europeans to rebel and saying the Americans will come and help you if you do. So the Hungarians were convinced, Hungarian freedom fighters were convinced the Americans were going to come to their aid, because they believed the propaganda that in the radio broadcasts that had been coming out of the Eisenhower administration for the past 4 years. All of a sudden, Eisenhower and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, realize or fear that if we do something in Hungary, we're stepping over a line with the Soviet Union, and it could lead to a bigger war and ultimately a nuclear war. So having done everything to incite this rebellion, the Americans then kind of sit back and let it be crushed by the Soviets. And Wisner is on the scene and on the border with Hungary as eventually 200,000 Hungarians fled across the border as the revolution was being crushed. He watches these people coming over, and he has a massive nervous breakdown, from which he never really recovers. He's eventually diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but having gone from this position where he's the number 2, maybe number 3 man in the entire CIA, he's kind of shunted off to a job where he's just kind of just sitting behind a desk, and he ends up committing suicide. Coincidentally or not, he commits suicide on the 9th anniversary, the day of when it looked like the Hungarian Revolution had succeeded, October 30th, and when the Soviet troops were pulling out of Budapest, and it looked like victory was at hand. And so, again, coincidentally or not, on the very anniversary is when Wisner killed himself. And the last character in the book, main character, is a man named Peter Sichel. And Peter is kind of the biographer's proverbial chest of letters found in an attic. Peter Sichel is still alive. He's 98 years old, and just as sharp as a tack. Peter was from a German Jewish family that fled Nazi Germany in the mid-30s. They came to the States because he was obviously a fluent German speaker. He was also put in the OSS during World War II. He starts out working with kind of a facet which I had no knowledge of. He works the black market exchange, the international black market currency, because if you're dropping commandos behind enemy lines, they need money, and they need actual money, and they need the money that is in the occupied country at that moment. So he spent 2 years running around Europe playing this black market of all kinds of different currencies. He then, in the last year of the war, is in charge of sneaking German POWs who've come over to the American side, the Allied side, sneaking them across no man's land. And these incredibly complicated operations where you slip people through no man's land into Nazi-held territory, and then to get them back again. He had the reputation, or the nickname in the OSS as the Wunderkind, the Wonder Child, because he was just so brilliant. To the point where when the war's over, he's made it's the precursor to the CIA, but essentially the CIA station chief in Berlin. And Berlin is now the ground zero of the coming Cold War. And the Cold War really already getting started by 1945. And just as an indication of just how clueless the Americans were of the coming battle with the Soviets, certainly in Berlin at that time, there were thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Soviet intelligence officers running around. Peter was put in charge of a 9-man unit. That was the only covert operations unit in Berlin. And he had just turned 23. And not to take anything away from Peter's brilliance, because he is a brilliant man, but it just really shows they really had no clue of what was coming. As running the CIA station in Berlin, Peter realized he's incredibly outmanned, and he just has to learn by doing. At one point in 1946, Truman sends down this order that he wants to get a sense of what the Soviets are up to in their zone in eastern Germany. Are they planning to go to war? Are they planning to attack the western sectors? So Peter sends out this massive informant and spy network it's called Operation Grail, throughout East Berlin and into Eastern Germany, Soviet-held Eastern Germany. And they're reporting back. It goes on for a couple of months. And then in a single 24-hour period, virtually all his agents, almost 300 people, disappear. Again, the Soviets had his networks completely infiltrated from the get-go. They were just waiting for the moment to strike. And so all these people, ended up either in the gulags or being executed. As time went on, Peter's operations became more sophisticated, I guess you'd say, but also kind of more morally complex. He starts working with a lot of former Nazi military intelligence officers, men who had served during World War II on the Eastern Front, and under the rationale that, well, these people know the Soviet enemy the best. At one point, he's running an operation where he has flipped, he's doubled, as they say, a Soviet agent who's running this entrapment scheme where this guy is luring German civilians into East Berlin, where they're then grabbed by the Soviets. And in order to maintain the double, in order to keep this guy's operation going and to protect him, he not only has to let this entrapment scheme go on, but he has to hide this guy from the American military authorities who are looking to arrest him. Working gradually, at a certain point, Peter is working with men who are wanted for war crimes, the Nazis who are wanted for war crimes, to the point where at one point he worked on creating a false identity to get a Nazi war criminal, a really notorious one, to get him out of Germany and actually to let him emigrate to the United States. And that man ended up being the highest ranking and the most notorious Nazi war criminal to ever be deported from the United States for lying on his passport, or applying for citizenship. It's going to also I mentioned about with Wisner, with his run-ins with Hoover and the Red Scare, and it came back to haunt Peter Sichel also. At a certain point, Peter was in a position where he's watching so many of these infiltration operations that are all ending disastrously, and he's in a position where he just starts canceling them. both first he's in Berlin, but then he's on a senior position back in Washington at CIA headquarters, and he starts canceling these operations to the point where his underlings who want these operations to go forward begin to get suspicious of whether maybe Peter is a KGB mole himself. So Peter ends up getting investigated by the FBI as a possible KGB mole. And he's cleared. He ends up becoming CIA station chief in Hong Kong in the late 1950s. And the story how he quit the CIA is kind of a great one. He was in 1960 the new number 2 man in the CIA came out and had a meeting with the station chiefs of the Southeast Asia, and he announced a new operation that the CIA was going to operate, which was they were going to airdrop Chinese national soldiers, anti-communists for Chiang Kai-shek's supporters, into mainland China, into Mao's Red China, to foment revolutions. And they were going to spend $100 million dropping these guys behind enemy lines. Peter had seen this whole thing happen in Eastern Europe, and it had all been a disaster. So during a break in this meeting, he meets the number 2 guy out in the hall where they're meeting, and says, you know what, we would save so much time and money if we just kill these guys ourselves. And he says, I'm out, I'm done. And so right then he quit the CIA. And Peter went on to took over his family's wine business. The Sichel family wine business had gone back 5 generations in Germany. And it was a distributorship around the world. And so Peter, living in New York, took over the Sichel wine company and brought the world Blue Nun. If people are of a certain age, you'll remember Blue Nun. I'll just a funny note with Peter that at one point we've become very friendly, and at one point I said to him, you know, Peter, okay, you know, all the things you did with the CIA, you know, working with Nazi war criminals, okay, it was times were strange, you know, overthrowing governments, you know, I get all that, but I said, but come on, Blue Nun, I mean, you know, what did the world ever do to you? And he laughed, and he said, he has this wonderful kind of, you know, Central European accent, and he said, Scott, do you know that old saying that, you know, every people get the government it deserves? Well, every people get the wine it deserves too. So, so those are kind of the 4 characters. I was just going to talk a little bit about, you know, what I think their stories add up to, and kind of thematically what I was trying to do with this book. And so again, you know, this 12-year arc of where we ended up in 1956 from where we had started out in 1944, and the kind of moral compromises, both of a nation and of the 4 men I write about, that they had to do along the way. Somewhat in their defense, at that time, the communist world was just expanding like mad. And new kind of cataclysmic events were happening almost on a weekly basis. And America was this isolationist country, all of a sudden thrust into being the global superpower. So I think that especially under Truman, it was just this reactive thing. We have to try whatever we can. You know, remember, you know, Communist China, 1949, then the Korean War, a year later. The Soviets got the nuclear weapon 3 years before, you know, anyone was predicting they would. So I think there was this real paranoia set in, where it was just like, we have to try anything that can work. And, you know, before we talk, you know, FDR talked about, you know, nurturing democracies and that we don't have that luxury now. We have to get into bed with you know, the people who are there. And if it's a military dictator, but he's staunchly against communism, well, then that's what we do. But all this really, really accelerated when Eisenhower came into office. And this is when you saw CIA overthrowing democratic regimes in Guatemala and Iran. And I really put so much of the blame of that on Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. Dulles, to my mind, was one of the great villains of the 20th century, and probably between him and Hoover, probably did more harm to the so-called American century than any 2 people I can think of. And in Dulus's mind, the world was black and white. It was good versus evil, and there was no neutrality. If you were either with the United States or you were against us, or you were in bed with the communists. To the point, and he also had this, frankly, kind of crazy idea. Anything that was coming out of the Soviet Union, he saw simultaneously as a sign of the regime's weakness and as part of their evil design to take over the world. So in 1953, Stalin dies, and very quickly, within days after Stalin dies, there's kind of a junta temporarily ruling at the Kremlin. They send out this message to the West that they want an era of peaceful coexistence. And Churchill, who's back being prime minister in England, and who's a staunch Cold Warrior, he urges Eisenhower to send a placative or olive branch back. And John Foster Dulles says no. The only reason they're doing this is because they're on the ropes. They're about to fall apart. So don't give them anything. Let's just keep with the Cold War rhetoric, and we're going to fight them to the end. So again and again, there was a number of moments. Khrushchev, when he took over, gave this, it's called the de-Stalinization speech of denouncing Stalin, the crimes that Stalin had committed. Again, talking about liberalization, economic and political liberalization throughout the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. Dulles again says, don't give them anything. It's part of their evil design. They're trying to lull us into complacency, or it means they're about to fall apart. So, but either way, we have nothing to gain by joining them. So, to my mind, you just saw that play again and again, and I really do believe that if the Americans had played their cards a little bit differently during that period between when Stalin died in 1953 and the Hungarian Revolution in 56, what happened 33 years later with Mikhail Gorbachev could have happened under Khrushchev in the 1950s, but the Eisenhower administration was really just blind to it. And I'll close on just the thing that I think is also really important on all this, and it's something that I knew a bit about the Red Scare before I embarked on this project. But what I'd never seen people really talk about was how you see about the Red Scare of the blacklist in Hollywood and the people whose careers were destroyed in Washington. But you don't really see much of how it affected our foreign policy. And through, I use the example of Peter Sichel and Frank Wisner, how they both came under investigation as a result of the Red Scare. But what it also created was this climate where if somebody came up with a bad idea in the CIA to launch a commando operation somewhere, there was no repercussions for saying yes, or for saying a government is communist and we have to overthrow it. There was no repercussions for saying, actually, that government isn't communist, as neither Guatemala or Iran, the governments were communist. There's only repercussions if you try to block it. If you say, no, why are we doing this commando operation? We've done 8 of these before in this country, and we've lost everybody who's gone in. No, this government is not communist. We should try to foster good relations with it and steer it more to our side if that's the issue. Nobody really thought that way. So it was just the easiest thing, and to avoid the examination of people like Hoover or McCarthy or Richard Nixon, to just kind of go along with it and to see what worked. And the fact is that very little of any of this stuff worked. So I guess that's kind of about it. I am happy to take any questions that anyone has.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. In just a minute, we will have some time for Q&A. So folks, you can be thinking about what questions you'd like to ask. There's a lot of richness there to dig into. I have several questions myself that I'll defer to the end give others preference. But in a moment, before we start the Q&A, We would like to have a brief musical interlude and suggest that those of you who wish to, we'd encourage you to donate. It's through our generosity that we can show how meaningful the Sunday morning programs are. So if $5 is comfortable for you, feel free, more, less, none, whatever you choose. It would be greatly appreciated. And we also really appreciate all those of you who volunteer to keep the society up and running with your donations of time and money. Great, thanks. Welcome back. Thank you for donating if you did, and for thinking of some good questions. So I'll go ahead and read these out and then give Scott some time to answer. And so the first question is pretty specific about the coups in Iran and Guatemala that you referenced, and sort of the nobody questioning it, right? Just like, all right, let's do it. That sounds good. Keep on moving. No incentive to question. So how did those get authorized? Who was involved in it? Is it something the CIA really decided independently on its own, or was there some kind of other implicit or explicit direction from other branches of the US government?
It's a great question. It's remarkable how small the people involved in both of those operations were. I'll talk about Iran first, because it was first. It's complicated because basically Mossadegh, who was the new prime minister of Iran, had nationalized the oil industry, which up until then, the British had completely monopolized it. So the British had been trying to overthrow Mossadegh for a couple of years. At one point, under the Truman administration, they'd gone to Truman's administration and said, will you help us overthrow Mossadegh? And they said no. But when Eisenhower came in, the British immediately started laying down this groundwork of like, he's a communist, or if he's not a communist, Mossadegh, if he's not a communist directly, the communists are waiting in the wings to take over. So John Foster Dulles, Eisenhower said, great, let's get rid of him. What's amazing is how, without the British involvement, it was a very similar situation in Guatemala, where you had Arbenz, who was a populist, left of center, not a communist, left of center president elected. moved to, on this agrarian reform program that enraged Standard Fruit, which basically Guatemala was the original banana plantation. Almost all the arable land in the country was owned by Standard Fruit. They start putting the word to the Eisenhower administration that Arbenz is a communist. So, and again, very, very quickly convinced the administration that they should be overthrown. In both cases, it was a really small group of CIA officers who involved in the coups. And there's an amazing symmetry between the two, where in both it was kind of a psychological warfare. In both places, they created this kind of phantom army that was supposedly going to liberate the country against the president or prime minister. And in both cases, the coups kind of failed. They had just kind of fallen apart on their own volition. And at the 11th hour, in both Iran and Guatemala, at the 11th hour, when the CIA was saying, okay, this didn't work, we got to get our people out, all of a sudden, the sitting government collapsed. It was kind of a war of nerves, and in both cases, the other side blinked first. So it was these amazing kind of 11th hour successes that were completely improbable, but played out in kind of exactly the same way. And understanding the disaster at Bay of Pigs, a lot of that explanation is what happened in Guatemala and Iran, because twice the Americans got, filled an inside strait in two coups at virtually no cost and very, very little loss of life. But really, for lunch money, overthrew these two countries. And so when it came to the Bay of Pigs in 1961 in Cuba, they thought, well, it's worked twice. Let's try it. Let's go for number three. So it's amazing how homespun and small both Guatemala and Iran were.
Great. Another question has to do sort of more generally with the actions of the CIA in comparison to other types of similar secret agencies and other governments. So what's your sense of kind of how the KGB or others were operating at that time? And, if sort of the actions of the CIA caused us to lose some of our moral standing, was that what was happening in other governments as well?
Right. Well, I'm not sure that there was much of a moral standing under Stalin for the Soviets to lose. Yeah, I focus on the CIA. The Soviet system was utterly brutal, to the point where what happened time and time again is Stalin, especially under Stalin. Stalin had this paranoia. Well, he had paranoia about everything, but he had a real paranoia about the West. So some of his best intelligence officers and generals and senior officers, if they'd spent much time in the West and they were recalled to the Soviet Union, most of them, when they got back to Moscow, were either sent off to the gulags or executed because they had spent so long in the West that they were tainted. This happened again and again. As far as on the level of brutality is in a way you really kind of can't compare it until maybe you get to what the Americans and the CIA were doing in Vietnam. But in the intelligence world, I'll just give you kind of a fascinating example of what the Soviets were capable of doing. And this continued right up through the 1980s. The Soviets would do this thing, what's called a dangle. They would send across a false defector to the West. Somebody in the military or in the KGB, and saying, I want to defect, and a way to build up his bona fides of this false defector would be to compromise other KGB officers and operations around the world. And some of these guys would come across, and they would betray. In fact, they weren't betraying because they were under the orders of their own superiors back in Moscow. But they would turn out 15, 20 of their colleagues in the field, and those men would then get arrested, in some cases be killed. But it was all to build up the credentials of the false defector who was coming across. And some of these false defectors operated then in the West for decades. So that's something that it just would not have happened in, certainly not CIA, wouldn't have not happened in MI6, the British intelligence. This idea that you'd send somebody over, that you would sacrifice lower level officers, or agent officers being people, actual employees of the intelligence agency, spies or agents being people in the field, usually locals. It just wouldn't have happened. But this also plays to why the Soviets just constantly ran circles around the Americans, because there was a level of cold-bloodedness and frankly brutality that just Americans just wouldn't have kind of countenanced, and they continue to do it today, frankly.
Somewhat related question a bit is, someone asks I believe by the 1980s, the CIA was massively overestimating the strength of the Soviet Union. Was that an outgrowth of that same mentality that you're talking about in terms of the Red Scare? Was there something else at play? What led the CIA to sort of have that overestimation?
Yeah, I mean, probably somewhat. There was probably this kind of carry on residue of they've always, certainly in the intelligence game, they've always been more clever than us. They've always been smarter than us. But I think also the CIA had been caught out so many times. For instance, the CIA estimate of when the Russians were going to get the nuclear weapon, they were off by 3 years. They didn't see Afghanistan coming in 1980, the invasion of Afghanistan coming in 1980. They certainly did, caught completely flat-footed in the Hungarian Revolution. So time and again, the CIA was really quite bad at predicting what the Soviets were going to do. So to my mind, there's kind of an institutional bias at a certain point of we're always caught like underestimating. So why don't we overestimate? And if we say that the Soviets have 10,000 nukes, and actually turns out they only have 4,000. Well, we're not going to get in trouble for that. We're only going to get in trouble if the reverse. If we say they have 4,000 and 10,000. So I think that kind of institutional, you can see it happen in kind of any office place of kind of overestimating, whether what something's going to cost or whatever. And added to that, of course, you had what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex. This massive industry in America that makes its living off of defense contracts, and certainly they were always trying to promote the Soviets as a greater threat. Kennedy talked about the missile gap that supposedly happened under the Eisenhower administration. That now the Soviets are ahead of us in missiles. Well, there was no missile gap, but people got to Kennedy and convinced him of that. That was the case.
That's helpful. Thanks. I have several more questions that I'll get to in a minute about particular questions, particular actions, particular countries, particular players. But there was one that takes us in a slightly different direction, which is to ask a little bit more about your process as a writer. So, doing this kind of work, you said this is sort of biography, right? You're writing a biography, and this is in historical research, which involves some of the same kinds of skills as journalism, but it's a little different, right? You interview in a different way, you look at sources in a different way, and you mentioned so clearly to us that that you've had developed a good relationship with one of your subjects, with one of the participants, with Peter. So kind of how did you come to choose these 4 men, and what can you tell us about your process, your methods, and what sort of how you approach this kind of work that's different from how you would approach the reporting you do?
That's a good question. So they're all good questions. So when I'd come up with the idea as I mentioned earlier, what fascinates me is to find, looking at periods of history where it's not just people sitting behind desks that are making decisions, where there's actually, kind of normal people out in the field, where through their force of personality, they can change things. And that was clearly the case with the early CIA, as was with my last book, Lawrence in Arabia, where I focused on T. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, and 3 other spies who were running around the Middle East during World War I. But in that case, kind of with virtually no adult supervision. And this is kind of the story of why T.E. Lawrence was able to do what he did in Arabia, is that no one was really watching. The Middle East was such a sideshow to World War I that if he went off and started a revolution with these Arab tribes, okay, we'll go for it. No, you don't really have to report to anybody. Somewhat, it's not quite as true when you're talking about the early CIA, but it's similar. These guys had tremendous freedom of initiative when they were in the field. So when I came up with this kind of template of what I wanted to do, I started looking at. I had certain criteria that I wanted. I wanted people from who had been operating in different parts of the world. I wanted someone from Asia. I wanted someone in Europe, obviously. Frank Wisner, he was mostly in Washington, so he's kind of the grand orchestrator of everything. He's kind of the almost the narrator in a way, because he was watching everything. And I wanted them to have interesting lives, having done interesting stuff from 1944. What were they doing in World War II? Through the mid 1950s. So as I set out, I must have looked at probably 25 to 30 different CIA officers during this, and some of them had amazing stories. Except that all of a sudden in 1952, they would leave the CIA and move over to the State Department and be stamping visas at the embassy in Paris. So the amazing thing is that through this winnowing process and really just this kind of basic criteria I had of different geographic regions, different jobs, doing interesting stuff over this 12-year arc, I ended up with 4 people. There was not a fifth one to choose from. It was these four men I write about. And at the time, I was kind of nervous if I would really find even those 4. And as I said, finding the others have long since died, but to find Peter Sichel was just kind of an amazing find. And it's just to expand on that. As I said, I've got to know Peter very well. I got a call a few weeks ago from a friend of his who's known Peter for 50 years, and very close. He and his wife have gone on European vacations with Peter and Peter's wife. And he said, I've known Peter for 50 years. He's a really good friend of mine. He never told me he was in the CIA. And I just thought, once a spy, always a spy. And it took me some convincing when I was, approaching Peter Sichel to get him to talk to me. But
that is a great story. They didn't even know. My gosh,
I had no idea.
Like the whole Julia Child piece, or those kinds of things that come out later.
Yeah.
Wow, what a significant part of someone's life, and he wasn't under need to be secret about it anymore.
No, although it's funny, even at 98, there are certain things that Peter will, when I was interviewing, I interviewed him 8 or 9 times. There were certain things he would walk up to and then he said, I can't talk about that. Yeah. And he left the CIA in 1960. So you're talking about 60 years later. And, so yeah, you're actually, when you're with the CIA, you're kind of under a lifetime stricture that way. So.
I suppose. Interesting. Okay, now back into some of the nitty-gritty questions people had about particular people, specifically about Wisner, actually. How did domestic politics on the part of Eisenhower impact his letting Wisner down? Was it just easier to back down? Were there other elements at play? What can you talk a little bit more about that?
I assume that's like specifically to about the Hungarian Revolution. When Eisenhower came into office, I talk about this a bit in my book, and I think it's kind of a crucial thing to understanding what happened with the Cold War. When Eisenhower came in 1952, a few months later, he came up with this doctrine called the New Look, and the New Look doctrine was essentially that America reserved the right of a nuclear first strike. The euphemism was massive retaliation, but you're talking about nuclear war. If it felt that its vital national security interests were at stake. So of course the Soviets, as soon as New Look came out, the Soviets said the same thing. We reserve the right for a first strike. What no one really, what's astonishing, and I had to read through tons of commentary about the New Look doctrine and everything. What's astonishing is what nobody seemed to put together is that what you had now done with the New Look was you'd put the world on a hair trigger for nuclear war. On the one hand, what it did two things. On the one hand, it froze in place the Iron Curtain, the line of the Iron Curtain. Because now if the Soviets tried to make an incursion into Western Germany, that was in America's national vital interests. It would invite a nuclear retaliation. Similarly, if there was a rebellion in Hungary, and this is why the Americans didn't go into Hungary. It's because, oh, wait a minute, this is the Soviets' backyard. If we go into Hungary, could this escalate into a nuclear war? Of course, the Americans not knowing that Khrushchev had already kind of decided, Khrushchev had already blinked, he was already planning to leave Hungary, but then changed his mind because the Americans hadn't done anything. So on the one hand, what New Look did was it froze the Iron Curtain in place for the next 35 years. What it simultaneously did is it opened up the entire rest of the world to the Cold War, because Angola is not in anyone's vital national security interests. Laos isn't, Bolivia isn't. So it made the rest of the world the Cold War playground for both powers. And so what you saw is soon as when and then Guatemala and Iran, that kind of stemmed from New Look. The Soviet Union is not going to start a nuclear war if you overthrow the government in Guatemala. In fact, the Soviets didn't even have diplomatic relations with Guatemala, but even if it had been a communist regime. So that's what really kind of escalated this whole thing. And then, of course, it ends up being the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that, in a way, getting the nuclear weapons out of Cuba was the kind of final affirmation of New Look. But what it meant was that whole battlefield, certainly the European battlefield, was now frozen in place for the next almost 4 decades.
Thanks. This next question asks you to engage in a little speculation and thinking about if presidential administrations had been different. So, Truman refused to help the British overthrow Mossadegh in Iran, but Eisenhower and Dulles jumped in. How different might things have turned out under President Stevenson?
Oh, yeah, if Adlai Stevenson won, I think massively. I mean, there are a bunch of crossroads of history in this during this 12-year period. FDR dying when he did. If FDR had not died in April of 1945, 2 months before the end of the war, I think FDR would have stood up against Stalin in a very different way than Truman was. Truman really was a kind of a deer in headlights for the first couple of years of his administration, and he was very slow to see that the Soviets were just grabbing everything they could. And so by the time he kind of woke up to what the Soviets were doing and came out with the Truman Doctrine in 1947, Eastern Europe was already gone. The Soviets already had control of it all. So that's one huge crossroads. I think another huge crossroads is the questioner is asking. Stalin died 6 weeks he died in early March of 1953, 6 weeks into the Eisenhower administration. If he had died a year earlier under Truman, or if Stevenson had been president, I believe either one of those men would have accepted, would have engaged the olive branch that the new leadership in the Kremlin was offering. So I think just horrible moment, timing of history that Stalin died when he did. If it had only been a little bit sooner, again, I think history would have been just dramatically different. And as the question is asking, yes, under Stevenson, he would have treated Stalin's death completely differently. He would have Khrushchev's de-Stalinization speech in 1956. That was just a flagrant sign to the West of we want to start a new era, ignored by the Eisenhower administration. They saw it as a trick. Stevens would have looked at it very differently, I'm sure.
So keeping with that theme of sort of how presidential administrations can sort of have this impact on larger operations, a questioner asks, is the time required for long-run operations inherently at odds with our 4-year administration cycle? Are presidents always hamstrung by their predecessors?
That's a great question. It's a great question. And it's funny. I'm always reminded of something that Peter Sichel said to me. Peter he was raised in Europe. He has a kind of a European sensibility, although obviously being an American most of his life. He said, the problem with Americans, on a broader level, when you're confronting a nemesis like the Soviet Union, is the Soviets think in terms of decades. The Chinese think in terms of centuries. Americans think in terms of quarters. And I think he's absolutely right. On a broader level, what adversaries of the United States know is that you wait for the next administration to come along, or you try to finish before. And I'll use a current example of that. The Taliban in Afghanistan. They are rushed to make a peace settlement with the Americans, with now the Americans having a firm departure date out of Afghanistan. They did this before this election. So why did they rush to get it done now? Because that treaty is going to be almost impossible for the new incoming administration to revisit. And what the Taliban know is that you just wait out the Americans. The Viet Cong knew this. I mean, it took a long time for that to reach fruition for the Vietnamese, but you just wait out the Americans, and eventually they get tired and go home. So I mean, you can quote me on this. Say a year and a half from today, the current government, the Western allied government that the Americans are in Afghanistan, that Americans are promising to uphold, will be gone, and the Taliban will have completely taken over. So yeah, the adversaries know that the best thing to do with Americans is you just wait them out, because eventually they get tired and go home, or a new administration comes in.
Wow, that's a little disheartening.
Yeah, sorry.
But I'll check back in a year and a half and see if your prediction comes true. All right, this next question takes us to a different part of the world, to Central America, and asks us to think back a few decades. And the questioner just wants to know if you could tell us a little bit more about the CIA operations in Nicaragua and in El Salvador, and what involvement of U.S. troops there was or wasn't, if you could just sort of recap for us.
Yeah. Well, we never had troops, fighting troops on the ground. We had military advisors in Salvador, and to a small degree in Guatemala. The Guatemalan government was even more brutal than the Salvadoran government, of kind of the slaughter of anybody who was seen as a leftist. So we had military advisors there under the Reagan administration. But what I was talking about earlier, at the time in 1984, when I was talking about the incident that I saw, a new Salvadoran government was just coming in, but in order to get congressional approval, they had to keep the Congress, which was in control of the Democrats. They required the Reagan administration to recertify the human rights record of the Salvadoran government, I believe every year. So the Reagan administration was always having to kind of look the other way, or saying that the human rights situation was getting better, and maintaining this fiction about the death squads. The death squads were operated right out of the military barracks in San Salvador. But of course, they could never acknowledge that, because they would get recertified by Congress, and aid would be cut off to the Salvadoran government. So this was a game that was played, I think until like 1986. And Nicaragua was a little different. Nicaragua had a leftist government. So now, instead of upholding it, the Reagan administration and the CIA are trying to overthrow it. So they had CIA hired mercenaries on the ground on the border in Costa Rica and Honduras, who were working with the Contras to try to overthrow the Nicaraguan government.
A couple of folks have asked a variation of the same question. They're wanting to know if, in your opinion, if the CIA has really reformed out of this behavior of regime change, or if this history of CIA actions around trying to instigate regime change continues to influence the world's view of the U.S.
Right. I don't know. No, I wouldn't say they've weaned themselves completely from trying to foment regime change. But if I could just kind of redirect the question a little bit, I think that the CIA has always had this built-in contradiction to it, which is it's always had this analytical side and the action side, the covert operations side of things. And and to oversimplify, it's kind of the librarians and the cowboys. And how do you fit those two types of people and types of bureaucracy, which are very, very, very different, obviously, within one agency? And we're the only country that does it. Like there's really a separation between those two things in all the European intelligence agencies. So we've never quite figured that out. And so what ends up happening is periodically, as history moves on, is that, the analytical side is really the vast majority of the CIA. But then something like the invasion of Afghanistan comes along. And now the CIA they're activating their covert operations side of things. And not only their covert operations side, they're actually recruiting, again, like the mercenaries in Nicaragua, all these kind of contract workers. So the massive people were CIA employees, not full-time employees, but contractors were in Afghanistan, probably still are, in Iraq after the invasion of Iraq in 2003. So there's so you get this very awkward, unwieldy organization that's trying to do everything from analysis to shooting guns in the field, and the CIA has never really quite figured out how that all knits together very well.
You don't know this, but I'm a librarian, so I love that you said librarians and cowboys, because yes, there's some differences there.
Right.
We have a question from someone about Russia and what kind of a view we should have on Russia. But before I ask you to ask that one, I'm just going to use moderator's privilege here and ask a question that I have. And I don't know if you have an answer. Less about your book, less about the CIA, but just thinking about from your experience reporting on strife-torn countries and thinking about some of this recent so-called frozen conflict that flared up between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And kind of, Turkey continues to exercise its influence with Azerbaijan. Russia continues to exercise its influence. And full disclosure, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the very first group into the Republic of Armenia in 1992. So I have watched it carefully and have many, many beloved friends still on the ground there. So I'm just wondering, thinking about how some of these decisions, Stalin kind of drew some borders. Like these things have long tails, right? And these kind of decisions that are made decades ago continue to cause problems in conflicts around the world. So I just wonder if you want to opine for a minute. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, It's funny. I think some of this goes to it goes back to the sort of isolationist nature of America for most of its history. We really only we talk about how Japan was this closed world for centuries, but America was pretty closed off too until the end of World War II. And I think that there's on one hand there's huge areas of the world that Americans in general, but I'm talking about even American administrations really don't understand very well, haven't spent a lot of time studying, and really are just kind of, if something happens there, are kind of reactive to try to play catch up to what's going on. I mean, you mentioned Armenia and Azerbaijan. Does the Trump administration even have a policy there? I haven't seen it. Do they have a diplomat that's trying to engage in that? Not that I know of. It seemed to be just kind of on a larger level, kind of taken over by by the Russians, as you say, and the Turks. Another thing I think really plays into this, and I've seen this, covering war zones around the world, and it really kind of grew out of September 11th, is that both embassies and the CIA around the world now, in so many places, live in essentially in underground bunkers. I was covering the war in Darfur in 2005, I think, and went to have an interview with the the number two guy in the American embassy in Khartoum, capital, and the American embassy in Khartoum, and I'm sure it's still the same today, was a fortress unlike I've been to the White House once, and getting into the American embassy in Khartoum was so much harder. The entire building was wrapped in this kind of chicken wire, like wire mesh, like thick wire mesh. It's maybe a 6-story, 7-story building. All the diplomats lived in an annex immediately adjacent to the office building. They never went anywhere. They were stuck in this bunker. So how can they really know what is happening in Sudan or in the region? So I think, and in fact, when I had this interview with the deputy chief of mission, he ended up interviewing me because I wanted to talk to him about American policy in Darfur, and there really wasn't one. And he just wanted to ask me questions about what was happening on the ground there because he couldn't go there, and his underlings couldn't go there because they're all under strictures of out of fear of being targets of terrorism. So now America's really in the blind in looking around the world. I was in Oslo a few years ago, Norway, the capital of Norway, and the American embassy in Oslo looks like a fortress. So so this is just being replicated around the world.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that, having been in Armenia when the very first U.S. embassy was opened, and then going back and visiting just a few years ago, it's exactly what you said. Yeah. It's not on the main street. People aren't engaging. People aren't having meals with Armenian. They're not. It's all right. post 9/11. We've got to protect ourselves. Right. So maybe this will be the last question then, and we'll do some announcements. But so one person asks really about the U.S. perspective on Russia right now. What's sort of an appropriate, realistic view? We hear lots of things from the current administration about Russia. What's your sense of a good way to think about the relationship between U.S. and Russia going forward?
It's kind of funny coming from a very liberal background, but and maybe it's. I'm still liberal in every other way. I think maybe my view of the Soviet Union has changed somewhat as a result of working this book. I think it's a mistake to think of Russia as anything other than an adversarial power, and that's maybe. It's certainly exacerbated by Putin and the regime he's created there, and his cyber attacks on the West, and the games he's playing, with the gas pipelines into Western Europe, the cyber war he's done in the Baltic states, what he allegedly did here in the elections in 2016. But I think it's something in the very nature of empires, and we're an empire. I think one thing that got confused in the Cold War somewhat was or clouded at least, was this idea that this was a war between capitalism, democracy, and communism. And I don't think it ever was that. I think at the end of World War II, there were two world powers. There was us and the Soviet Union, and if the Soviet Union could have been a democracy. And we still would have had an adversarial relationship. That I just think that is the nature of kind of geopolitics. When France and Britain controlled the world, they were always adversaries. So, I certainly hope that the incoming administration takes a harder line with Putin. I can't go to Russia because years ago I wrote an article about Putin's rise to power. And just to briefly, he used this series of apartment building bombings in Moscow in 1999, in which about 400 civilians were killed. He blamed it. He had just been named prime minister as the third prime minister under Yeltsin that year. He blamed it on Chechens and started the Second Chechen War and proceeded to just wipe Chechnya virtually off the map. And that was proved very popular with the Russian people. And he rode that to power. And 20 years later, here we are. But there's all kinds of evidence that, in fact, the apartment building bombings in Russia were the work of the KGB, or the FSB, as it was called then, of which Putin used to head. It was essentially his Reichstag fire, the pretext that allowed him to assume dictatorial powers. So I've always I've never seen Putin as a as a friendly leader. I think that I think the United States is going to have problems with him until he's gone.
Thank you so very much. What a wonderful perspective you shared. It's really been fascinating for me, and it definitely makes me want to read your book. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. That was my pleasure. Great questions. So
I wanted to close today's session with a quote from the current CIA director, Gina Haspel, a rarity in the Trump administration's national security apparatus, a career professional who has beaten the odds and survived repeated personnel purges. Although, as many of you may have seen on Thursday, that might be changing. President Trump seems like her job is now tenuous. He is weighing firing her, as it turns out. But in any case, here is a quote from some remarks she made in September 2018 that I thought were relevant. Within the intelligence community, CIA is the keeper of the human intelligence mission. Technical forms of collection are vital, but a good human source is unique and can deliver decisive intelligence on our adversaries' secrets, even their intent. Thank you all for joining us for this program, and please feel free to join us for coffee hour.